Hello, and welcome back for another week of Read It First by Lisa Gray, a podcast dedicated to discussing a new book each week. This week, the discussion is over Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel so you never miss the next discussion. I can honestly say that I wasn't a fan of this book. I liked the story, don't get me wrong, but I found it was very difficult to follow and not incredibly well written. It bounced way too much for my liking, and I tried listening and reading it, and neither was easier to follow. I was hopeful that it was just the AI sounding voices, but reading it was pretty hard too, just because there's a lot of punctuation, and like I said, it jumps back and forth. Like at one point, you're going back and forth between students getting a tour to workers to internal dialogue. Like, at least tell me where I'm going. But I enjoyed the story. I liked the idea behind it. The utopian society is definitely something that is wanted. And I have absolutely no issue with the fact that this book's been banned in several schools due to the promiscuous sex throughout. I don't really feel that it was that promiscuous. It was kind of just a discussion of everybody is for everyone. It's women don't own their bodies, that it's just kind of owned by everyone, which not really lovely, but a different point of history, this type of thing was completely acceptable. Different faiths kind of came up, and that's where we got more monogamy, where in the past our nature was polyamory. Another aspect of the book, which to some might be controversial too, is that there's drugs as a prominent part of life. They do soma all the time, which we'll discuss a little bit more. And either women are sterile or are on birth control unless and until they're told otherwise. They even discuss erotic play being commonplace in toddlers, that their toddlers are running around naked and frolicking. Which, let's be fair, experimenting is normal at all ages, but in our society, it's really not encouraged like it is in Huxley's created world. So, Huxley describes in this book a futuristic world which is controlled by science and technology, versus the current one, which is more or less controlled by politicians and whoever has the most money. At the current state in this world, this really doesn't sound too bad, especially me being a scientist. I mean, if science and technology were the leaders of things, most likely we'd have less aggression because it's more flexible. We're focused on improvements, not focused on what makes everything sound better and who's going to get more money out of it. Both science and technology are continually changing. What was true even yesterday, based on a new study, might be false today. And it's not that anything is a lie, it's just we continually evolve our knowledge. And like life, both science and technology evolves, which I think is kind of what we need as a populace. So, to that extent, I do love Huxley's idea. Anyways, the book starts with a class of students coming in to see how the Hatchery and Conditioning Center of London works. Multiple times in the beginning, they mention the world states. And the motto for the world states is community, identity, stability. I think those three things are pretty fair. Then the director of the hatchery starts with his tour. There's a slight discussion of kind of the practice of eugenics, because their focus is to make babies that will fit into certain parts of society. The hatchery is essentially conception to birth to the beginning of life. And based on what they want out of the embryos to do, the embryos are treated in different conditions. The whole basis of this is that we need workers who will work and do their job well, not get burnt out or daydream, cause issues, make mistakes. So not only are the embryos treated with different conditions to cause various levels of intellect, like getting oxygen deprivation or giving alcohol to the embryo, blood substitute, or twirling them around. But once they're born, they get subliminal messages that go through sleep. They each get treated with vaccines during everything, so they're protected from a lot of the viruses and stuff that are killing people even currently. The ones who are supposed to go work in space and aeronautics, they're spun around like crazy so that that's their comfort zone. They're not going to panic whenever they start getting thrown around. Some of them are treated to warmer temperatures or colder temperatures so that they'll be better workers in those climates. And then, of course, they're treated with various levels of hormones to control reproduction. So a lot of the women are given more levels of various sex hormones to make them infertile. And then they talk about once the babies are born, which this is all like bottled babies, and I don't think they even use surrogates in this world based on how it was being described. But they start to kind of use Pavlov and Freud. So Pavlov was focused on classical conditioning, which classical conditioning is essentially a cause and effect relationship. If any of you have studied psychology, you'll be familiar with Pavlov's most famous experiment, which was of conditioned reflex. He showed that over several experiments, a hungry dog would be trained to salivate at a certain sound, like a bell, regardless if food is present or not. Essentially, he would show the dog food, the dog would salivate, and he'd give a bell. Eventually, the dog associated the bell with salivation due to food. But Huxley describes babies being shown flowers in books, just to have an alarm set off and electrocute the babies to incense fear and distaste in anything to do with books and nature. They figure, well, if they don't travel, they'll get more work done. They won't be as consumption heavy. And then they kind of also discuss Freud, which was another psychologist who focused on the psychoanalytical theory. So Freud's primary focus was on the unconscious mind and how it alters our perception of human behavior, that our actions are often driven by unconscious desires and experiences. Huxley states that our Freud had been the first to reveal the appalling dangers of family life. The world was full of fathers, was therefore full of misery, full of mothers, therefore of every kind of perversion from sadism to chastity, full of brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, full of madness and suicide. So if we kind of mix this together, it to me makes me think that Huxley feels fathers subconsciously or unconsciously, just depending on how you want to look at it, cause misery, while mothers are the cause of perversions, and other family members cause madness and suicide. I think they're missing quite a bit here, which, if you look into the whole psychological aspect of Freud, most psychologists feel that Freud missed a lot of points too. However, in this book, the main characters in the early part can't even think of such a thing as family because it really isn't commonplace in their community. They think it's really bizarre, and also, like later on, whenever John is talking about mother, they look at him like he's utterly insane. But while we're in the center, we also learn about controllers. Think of these as kind of individuals as a god amongst men. These are the ones who decide what is acceptable versus what is not. They have the background of everything that happened. They have the Bible and everything else that populations used prior to the 9-Year War. Which the 9-Year War is why they became this way. Kind of think of it as like the war and Hunger Games. The Hunger Games came out of that. This science and technology heavy world came out of it. One comment that particularly sticks with me is nowadays the controllers won't approve of any new game unless it can be shown that it requires at least as much apparatus as the most complicated of existing games. Essentially, unless the game furthers the individuals playing that game, it's not accepted. This seems a little crazy as new games are created every day. Granted, there's some that shouldn't be, but they are. I tend to think that most of the games we played in like the 70s to 90s outdoor during recess probably were acceptable. Games like dodgeball train us to be quick at avoiding collisions and to attempt to throw with precision. Red Rover, on the other hand, trains us to the idea of strength in numbers, of being strategic with either which pair you run at or who you're matched with who. You want a pair strong individual next to a weak one so that the strong one might help prevent a runner from breaking through and add another player to your team. On the other hand, a runner wants to choose the weakest link so that they can break through and take someone over to their side. But I like the idea of associating learning with games, as that does help with development. But sometimes games are needed to be just games. They're an escape, a downtime to relax. No one can safely function 100% of the time. It's not possible. But in Brave New World, that's kind of the goal. They remove the need for women to carry children and care for them, which would decrease the production of women. They give drugs like Soma to keep everyone happy. Soma in this book is a recreational drug that they take every day by pill, powder, or they put it into aerosolized form so that they breathe it in, and it helps maintain a sense of complacency and happiness. Even later on, they discuss putting different pheromones into the air because, well, people need to be angry occasionally, so we just do it in a controlled way. But the characters are said to reach for their soma multiple times throughout the day, sometimes just to avoid listening to a lecture they didn't want to listen to. They'd rather have been high than listen to whatever they were told that they needed to listen to. So, during the beginning, we're jumping back and forth between the discussion within the center of the students and another discussion between two workers, which are Lenina and Fanny. Fanny is talking about undergoing a 3-month pregnancy substitute, which I'm assuming that this is basically giving hormones to simulate pregnancy without actually being pregnant, while they are talking about going out. Lenina mentions that she's been seeing Henry for about 4 months, and Fanny notes that it's only been Henry. For them, monogamy isn't acceptable. It's not normal until you're about 35 or older. It's interesting that the phrasing for them is that it's bad form to have only one person that you're going steady with until you're older. They're insisted upon to be promiscuous, which is interesting as there's no need for children in this futuristic society, but as you read on, the goal is to make sure that there is no one basically angry about any feelings, and their goal is to try to get rid of feelings altogether. Kind of makes you think of the movie The Giver a little bit, or the book The Giver. But the controller discusses that they have made pains to remove as much emotions as physically possible. Interestingly, Bernard, which is one of the main characters, seems to have a bunch of emotions and even seems to not accept promiscuity as a given. There's a particular point where he hears two guys talking about having sex with Lenina and insisting that the other one needs to have sex with her as soon as possible, and Bernard goes pale with anger, especially whenever he heard the one guy telling the other that, oh, I'm surprised you haven't already had sex with her. He's so angry he's shaking, which that's not the norm in his society. He's kind of an abnormal person, as we'll come to discuss. we learn about their different caste system, which even within the caste system, there's levels of separation. There's the alphas, the betas, the gammas, the deltas, the epsilons, and within them there's pluses and minuses. The higher the level, so the alphas and the betas, they're more intelligent. They're typically larger. And one thing that's kind of interesting is each level has a different color associated with them, and they've been trained to kind of hate the next color. They think, oh god, gammas are green and that's just ugly. I'm so glad I'm not green. Or I think it's the deltas are khaki, and ew, I'm so glad I don't have to wear khaki. It's such an ugly color. But Bernard is one that doesn't fit the size of an alpha, and he is ironically an alpha plus. So he's kind of more intelligent than the other alphas. And another weird thing about him is that he likes to spend time alone, which in their community is taboo. But one of the best quotes from Bernard that really talks about his thought process as being different from the other alphas is talking about her as though she were a bit of meat. While grinding his teeth, thinking about punching the guys in the face while being told to try Lenina out. He really didn't like the fact that most men seem women as akin to meat. And as a woman of the 21st century, I think Bernard is refreshing. He doesn't feel that women should be passed around as something to try. He thinks that they should be more valued. So that also really leads him to being an outcast. But the biggest part of him being an outcast is that he's so small because, well, they think that potentially someone thought his bottle was a gamma and they put alcohol into his blood surrogate. The idea of purposely putting alcohol into a growing fetus is quite appalling, since we know that alcohol at different stages of fetal growth can impact the brain, the endocrine system, the gastrointestinal tract, the heart, the kidneys, and the liver. I mean, there's really not much part of a growing fetus that alcohol doesn't impact, but they don't care as long as they get the type of people they want for each level. There's a slight discussion of how things used to be before Fordism and before they started creating infants in the caste system. So you gotta keep in mind at this point, having a hatchery, that's the norm. Having birth, that's gross and disgusting to these people. But there's a quote that occurs around the time of the beginning that everyone belongs to everyone else. It's something that's drilled into all of the children's mind. And I think it's kind of interesting as it slightly ignores the divide, which we know is not true, because while flying in a helicopter to a date, Lenina makes a comment to Bernard of how hideous a color khaki is. And I'm glad I'm not a gamma. It's prejudice that were put into their sleeping brains, so kind of like subliminal messages, but in this particular sense, it's hypnopedia. So hypnopedia is sleep teaching where morals are taught on a repeat during the infant years of children while they are asleep. These messages become permanently embedded into their mind and become their permanent new artificial personality. Think of it like brainwashing. It's a legitimate psychological thing, which is a little disconcerting. However, one of the biggest things to note within this novel is that there's still a division. There's a division of color, there's a division of sex. I mean, at the time that Huxley wrote Brave New World, there was still a pretty heavy racial divide. And at one point in the book, they discuss that if sexism and racism is eradicated, then people would change their negative feelings from intolerance to the government's oppression. Everyone just accepts their lives as is because this is what they're told is normal. Another interesting thing is English is the only language left, which now, and even whenever Huxley was writing this book, and he was British, so native English speaker, English was the third most spoken language in the world. Number one being Chinese, specifically Mandarin, and number two being Spanish. So it's interesting that he chose English to be the predominant and only surviving language. Bernard questions the state and is repeatedly put down for it. He wonders why he's allowed to be intelligent enough to question it all, but is told not to. I kind of get him because I feel like sometimes teachers do that to us, even in the United States. I mean, questioning everything is normal. It's a great part of growing up, and if you're a parent, it's probably one of the most annoying things of, because why? Well, because this. Well, because why? Eventually, you're just kind of at your wit's end. So I kind of get why they get to the point where they're just like, sit down, stay in line. So Bernard eventually goes off to a reservation. He asks Lenina to go with him, and we see a world that we are more akin to. There's illness, there's poverty, there's aging, there's traditional birthing. Lenina talks about being put off by the smell of individuals and being disgusted by seeing breastfeeding of infants by mothers. They don't do that, and whenever they take showers, they get talcum powder and all of this other smelly stuff to put on their bodies as soon as they're done. So everything, I could only imagine the smell in their world. It probably smells like you're walking into a perfume store. Anyway, Bernard thinks it's interesting and proof of what happened before Ford. Ford, it's kind of like God for them. They'll mention the years to be AF, so for after Ford, instead of AD, Anno Domini, which was after the birth of Jesus. While on the reservation, both Bernard and Lenina meet a woman who is from civilization. This is Linda. Her son John is part of civilization, but was raised on reservation. I think it's kind of interesting because one thing that Linda comments is that when she first came there, she always thought civilization is sterilization. And she was really grossed that everything was not clean and there was dirt everywhere. But this is what the normal is once you're on the reservation. So John is her son. He is about the age of Lenina and Bernard, and he always feels like the odd man out. And I mean, for the reservation, he is. He's smarter and he looks different than the others. He's blonde and he's tall. He probably would have been an alpha if he was still in the community. But he expresses the want to go see the community, and Bernard thinks, this could be a great way to go up. So he talks to the controllers and convinces everyone to accept John in, and one of John's conditions is that Linda, his mother, would come with him. Interestingly, they often call her his aunt, but he does confirm later that she was his mother. So even as John goes to the community, he's a curiosity. He's still the odd man out. He has lived his life on this reservation, which is bizarre to them, and he's got different preconditioned ideals than what the alphas are. I mean, the alphas that he's experiencing are completely driven by consumerisms. There's one point where Lenina comments, "I love new clothes." And it's kind of a random pop-up. Kind of makes me think of Josie and the Pussycats. Whenever the marketing executives are using subliminal messages to increase what people buy and to put new trends out there, like, oh, orange is the new pink, or black is the new orange, like just continually trying to get people to buy. Kind of made me feel it. But I liked John because he had a different view on the world. For John, relationships were to be monogamous and premarital sex was taboo. It's a complete 360. He also believes in God. He hasn't read the Bible, but he knows about it. He also really feels that everyone should have their own mind and be able to think individually. they like the idea of free thinking. But they kind of discuss in the community that free thinking like that would break down the community and put them back to before the 9-Year War. Which kind of makes me think of the Hunger Games, where President Snow's talking to Katniss about needing to convince Panem that she loves Peeta and that she ate the berries in defiance of not losing her loved one, not in defiance of the Capitol. And if she doesn't, the whole system would break. Katniss only responds with how fragile a system is if only two people can break it. And I kind of feel that this somewhat applies here as well. But because of everything that's happening, the director gets taken down. Bernard becomes more assertive and confident because he's like, hey, everyone's paying attention to John here. John is basically his little thing to be pumped out. John becomes angrier and angrier because he doesn't like that there's that false happiness. He gets so angry at one point that he's throwing Soma out the window and has to get held back by security because that's not acceptable. John comments about experiencing sadness on the reservation while he was being an outcast because he was different. But he talks about reading Shakespeare and enjoying it, making pottery, and getting to look at the night sky and stars and just getting to enjoy it. He knows that forced happiness is false, but sorrow is true. The mass-produced people and manufactured emotions cannot be sustained because they're fabricated and they're artificial foundations. But the world state's contrived and controlled happiness is an easy out for people who don't want to shoulder responsibility for making choices. But for John, he'd rather be unhappy and free. For those in the community, they feel that if they're unhappy, well, they'll just take Soma, and it's great. It's a quick fix. Linda, before John starts throwing the Soma out the windows, is put into a Soma-induced coma because she is older and they feel she is dying, and John gets so angry because they just keep her in this coma and he can't say goodbye to her. He can't talk to her in her last time on Earth. And then in the hospital, they just have these kids running around and just being like, okay, whatever, death is death. And John's like crying because his mom's dying. And the nurse is getting angry at him for having such a display, and how dare he, because he's setting back the training on these children. It really is crazy because, I mean, to a sense, our population really tries to get, especially men, to rein in their emotions, but it's not weakness. It really isn't. So eventually Linda dies and he has to deal with it on his own. Jump ahead a little bit and we get to meet Heimholtz, which is kind of in the same boat as John and Bernard, but he's a writer and he wants to write more provoking things than whatever propaganda the government has chosen or whatever feel-good thing they want to have him do right now. I kind of imagine some journalists kind of feel the same thing in this current culture, because a lot of the journalist outlets, it's one way or the other. You either write Democratic or you write Republican. You don't really have much in the middle. Like, you have to take a side. But eventually, John and Bernard and Heimholtz all go off. John goes and chooses a solitary lighthouse where he hopes that he can live in peace. It's a lot nicer than the reservation, which he feels he should atone for, so he whips himself basically every day. Eventually, he is spotted, and he becomes this whole journalistic thing. They even make a movie about him. I mean, God, the breach, because it's not like he gave permission, but in their life, everybody belongs to everyone. So it's not like they're breaking any personal boundaries by doing this in their mind. At one point, they basically put John into a Selma-induced fog, and it sounds like there was an orgy or something. It was a really weird part of the book, but whenever John comes to the next morning, he remembers everything, and he goes, I can't do this. I can't go back to the reservation. I'm not welcome. The community is controlling. They want every aspect of my life. Fuck it, I'm done. And he goes and hangs himself in the lighthouse. I promise I am not meaning to choose so many upsetting books, because the last book we did also talked about suicide. It's just luck of the draw, as a way to put it, but if you have suicidal ideation, please, please, please contact 988. You can call or text the Suicide Prevention Hotline at any time. They care, we care. There's always an option. I'm sure you've got a lot more friends than you realize, but even if you don't feel like you do, the people at 988, they will listen to you. They will be there for you. They will help you. Please contact them. Anyways, to leave that depressing subject, next week it will not be depressing. Next week is a particular book that I love. And if you haven't read the book and you've only watched the movie, you're going to notice a lot of differences. But next week we are discussing Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton. It was published in November of 1990. So it was an astonishing technique for recovering and cloning dinosaur DNA has been discovered. Now humankind's most thrilling fantasies have come true. Creatures extinct for eons roam a Jurassic Park with their awesome presence and profound mystery, and all the world can visit them for a price. Until something goes wrong. In Jurassic Park, Michael Crichton taps all of his mesmerizing talent and scientific brilliance to create his most electrifying techno-thriller. Remember to subscribe to Rita First channel so you never miss out on a new discussion. Have a great day.